conclusions. Oral traditions are at present being collected in all African countries. The mass of information collected relates mainly to the 19th century and is only one source for historical reconstruction, the other main source for this period being written documents. There are 5 or 6 works each year presenting studies based almost entirely on traditions. Typologically they deal chiefly with political history and the history of kingdoms, and geographically they are concentrated mostly in East, Central and Equatorial Africa, where traditions are often the only sources. The chronologies rarely date back further than 1700 or become doubtful even before that date. SOME scholars believe that the bulk of the information does not even date back further than 1800. However, our increasing grasp of the nature of traditions enables those which were collected earlier to be better evaluated. Thus the exploitation of the traditions recorded by Cavazzi in the 17th century became possible only after a study in the field carried out in 1970. In addition to recent traditions, there exists a vast fund of literary information, such as the epic narratives, and of cosmogony data which can conceal historical information sometimes relating to very remote eras. The Sundari epic is one example. Tradition itself does not make it possible to establish dates. For instance, with regard to some historic sites in the Interlacustran region, a distorted recollection has been preserved dating back to the first centuries of our era or even earlier, but the oral source is silent as to the date. Only archaeology has been able to solve the problem. Similarly, it appears that Cavazzi's traditions to which W.E. hath just referred contain the historical residue which is of the greatest interest for the past of the peoples of Angola. There were succinct references to dynasties which succeeded each other, to forms of government which followed each other. In short, they summarize for the Upper Congo region social and political changes which may date back several centuries or even to 1,000 years before 1500. But there are no dates as landmarks. 164. Oral tradition and its methodology. There is one final pitfall to be noted. Often the collection of traditions is still superficial and their interpretation too literal and too closely tied to the culture concerned. This phenomenon contributes to maintaining the image of an Africa whose history consists of nothing but origins and migrations. That this is not true. But it must be admitted that that is the image which is reflected by traditions which seek to establish an identity. Superficiality of interpretation and lack of system in the collection of material are moreover the subject of most of the criticisms directed against the use of oral traditions, especially among ethnologists. Practical experience has proved that the greatest value of traditions lies in their explanation of historical changes within a culture. We find this to be so true almost anywhere that, despite the abundance of written sources for the colonial era, recourse has constantly to be made either to eyewitness accounts or to tradition to complete them and to make the evolution of the people comprehensible. But we find also that traditions are often misleading with regard to chronology and quantitative data. Moreover, any change which is unconscious because it is too slow, the mutation linked to a religious ideology, for example, escapes the memory of a society. Only fragmentary indications of changes can be found in oral records which do not deal specifically with history, and even then a complex exposition is necessary. This shows that oral tradition is not a panacea for all ills. But in practice it proves to be a first-class source for the last few centuries. Before that, it has less to contribute and it becomes instead a subsidiary science of archaeology. Its role in relation to linguistic and ethnographic sources has not yet been sufficiently explored, although in principle these three types of sources should together make a considerable contribution to our knowledge of ancient Africa, just as archaeology does. Traditions have proved their irreplaceable value. It is no longer necessary to convince people that they can be useful sources of information. Every historian knows this. What we must and do is to improve our techniques so that the sources can yield up their full potential wealth. That is the task before us. 165. The living tradition. 8. Hampad. Writing is one thing and knowledge is another. Writing is the photograph of knowledge but is not knowledge itself. Knowledge is a light that is in man. It is the heritage of all that our ancestors have known, and it is in the germ they transmit to us, just as the baobab tree is potentially in its seed. Dear No Boker 1 When we speak of African tradition or history we mean oral tradition, and no attempt at penetrating the history and spirit of the African peoples is valid unless it relies on that heritage of knowledge of every kind patiently transmitted from mouth to ear, from master to disciple, down through the ages. This heritage is not yet lost, but lies there in the memory of the last generation of great depositories of WHOM. It can be said, they are the living memory of Africa. In the modern nations, where what is written has precedence over what is spoken, where the book is the principal vehicle of the cultural heritage, there has been a long-standing notion that peoples without writing are peoples without culture. This quite unwarranted opinion has happily begun to wear off since the last two wars, thanks to the work done by certain great ethnologists of every nation. Today the innovative and courageous action of UNESCO is raising the veil still further from the treasures of knowledge transmitted by oral tradition, treasures which belong to the cultural patrimony of all mankind. For some scholars, the whole problem is whether we can place the same trust in the oral as in the written when it comes to evidence of things past. In my view, that is not the right way to put the problem. Written or oral evidence is in the end only human evidence, and it is worth what the man is worth. Does not what is said give birth to what is written, both over the centuries and in the individual himself? The world's earliest archives or libraries were. Sayyid Bokr Salaf d. 1940 spent his life in Bandiagar, Mali. Grand Master of the Muslim Order of Tijaniyya, he was also a traditionalist in African matters. Cf. A. Hampe Ba-Andim. Hard Air, 1957. The Living Tradition. The Brains of Men. Before he puts his thoughts on paper, the writer or the scholar has a private dialogue with himself. Before he writes a story down, MN reminds himself of the facts as they were told to him, or as he tells them to himself if it is his own experience. Nothing proves a priori that writing gives a more faithful account of the reality than oral evidence handed down from generation to generation. The chronicles of modern war serve to show that, as if said in Africa, each party or nation sees high noon from its own doorway, through the prism of its own passions or mentality or interests, or eagerness to justify its point of view. Moreover, written documents were not themselves always secured against deliberate forgeries or unintentional alterations at the hands of successive copyists, phenomena which inter alia gave rise to the controversies over Holy Writ. What is involved, therefore, behind the evidence itself, is the actual value of the man who is giving the evidence, the value of the chain of transmission he is part of, the trustworthiness of the individual and collective memory, and the price attached to the truth in a given society. In short, the bond between MN and the spoken word. Then it is in oral societies that the function of the memory is most highly developed, and, furthermore, the bond between MN and the word is strongest. Where writing does not exist, MN is bound to the word he utters. He is committed by it. He is his word, and his word bears witness to what he is. The very cohesion of society depends on the value of and respect for the spoken word. By contrast, with the encroachment of writing, we see writing gradually replace the spoken word, become the sole proof and the sole resort. We see the signature become the sole recognized commitment, while the deep sacred bond that used to unite MN and word disappears, to be replaced by conventional university degrees. In African traditions, at least the ones I know, which pertain to the whole savanna zone south of the Sahara, the spoken word had, beyond its fundamental moral value, a sacred character associated with its divine origin and with the occult forces deposited in it. Superlative agent in magic, grand vector of ethereal forces, it was not to be treated lightly. White religious, magical or social factors, then, combined to preserve the faithfulness of oral transmission. I think I should give the reader a brief account of these, the better to place African oral tradition in its context, and as it were illuminate it from within. If a true African traditionalist were asked, what is oral tradition? He would probably be nonplussed. He might perhaps reply, after a lengthy silence, it is total knowledge, and say no more. What does the term oral tradition cover, then? What realities does it convey? What knowledge does it transmit? What sciences does it teach? And who are its transmitters? Contrary to what some may think, African oral tradition is not limited to stories and legends or even to mythological and historical tales, and the man. 167. Methodology and African Prehistory. The French call a riot, a wandering minstrel/poet, is far from being its one and only qualified guardian and transmitter. Oral tradition is the great school of life, all aspects of which are covered and affected by it. It may seem chaos to those who do not penetrate its secret. It may baffle the Cartesian mind accustomed to dividing everything up into clear-cut categories. In oral tradition, in fact, spiritual and material are not dissociated. Passing from the esoteric to the exoteric, oral tradition is able to put itself within men's reach, speak to them according to their understanding, unveil itself in accordance with their aptitudes. It is at once religion, knowledge, natural science, apprenticeship in a craft, history, entertainment, recreation, since any point of detail can always take us all the way back to primordial unity. Based on initiation and experience, oral tradition engages man in his total being, and therefore we can say it has served to create a particular type of man, to sculpt the African soul. Linked with the everyday behavior of man and community, African culture is not, then, something abstract that can be isolated from life. It involves a particular vision of the world, or rather a particular presence in the world, a world conceived of as a whole in which all things are linked together and interact. Oral tradition is based upon a certain conception of man, of man's place and role within the universe. To situate it the better in its total context before studying it in its various aspects, we must therefore go back to the very mystery of the creation of man and the primordial inauguration of the Word, the mystery which the Word teaches, and in which it originates. Divine origin of the Word. Since I cannot validly speak of any traditions I have not experienced or studied personally, those of forest countries, especially, I shall take them why basic examples from the traditions of the savanna to the south of the Sahara, what was formerly called the Buffer and constituted the savanna zones of former French West Africa. The Bambara tradition of the Kombo teaches that the word, Kuzma, is a fundamental force emanating from the Supreme Being himself, Mba, creator of all things. It is the instrument of creation, that which Mba says, is, proclaims the cantor, the singing priest, of the god Kombo. The myth of the creation of the universe and of man which the Kombo master of initiates who is always a smith teaches circumcised youths reveals that when Mba felt a yearning for an interlocutor he created the first Mba. The story of Genesis used to be taught during the 63-day retreat to one of the great initiation schools of Amande, Mali. 168. The living tradition imposed on the circumcised in their 21st year, and then 21 years were spent in deeper and deeper study of it. On the edge of sacred wood, where Kombo lives, the first of the circumcised group would chant to a rhythmic beat, Mba, Mba, WHO is Mba, whereas Mba, the Kombo chanter would respond, Mba is infinite force. None can place him in time, nor yet in space. He is Dambali unknowable, Dambali uncreated, infinite. Then, after the initiation, the recital of the primordial Genesis would begin. There was nothing except a being. That being was a living emptiness, brooding potentially over contingent existences. Infinite time was the abode of that Ondi being. The Ondi being gave himself the name Mba. Mba wished to be known. So he created Fan, a wondrous egg with 9 divisions, and into it he introduced the 9 fundamental states of existence. When this primordial egg came to hatch, it gave birth to 20 marvelous beings that made up the whole of the universe, the sum total of existing forces and possible knowledges. But alas, none of those first 20 creatures proved fit to become the interlocutor communion that Mba had craved. So he took a bit of each of those 20 existing creatures and mixed them, and then, blowing the spark of his OW and fiery breath into the mixture, he created the NEW being, MBN, to WHOM he gave a part of his OW and NEME, MBA. And so this new being, through his name and through the divine spark introduced into him, contained something of Mba himself. Synthesis of all that exists, preeminent receptacle of the supreme force and confluence of all existing forces, Mba, MBN, received as his legacy a part of the divine creative power, the gift of mind and the Word. Mba taught Mba, his interlocutor, the laws according to which all the elements of the cosmos were formed and continue to exist. He installed him as guardian of his universe and charged him with watching over the maintenance of universal harmony. That is why it weighs heavy, being mob. 169. Methodology and African Prehistory. Initiated by his creator, MBA later passed all that he had learned on to his descendants, and that was the beginning of the great chain of initiatory oral transmission of which the order of Kom light the orders of Nma, corn, and so on, in Mali claims to be a continuator. Once M.A. Angela had created his interlocutor MBA, he spoke to him, and at the same time endowed him with the faculty of replying. The dialogue was begun between M.A. Angela, creator of all things, and MBA, symbiosis of all things. As they came down from M.A. Angela towards man, words were divine, because they had not yet come into contact with materiality. After their contact with corporeality they lost something of their divinity but took on sacredness. Hallowed in this way by the divine word, corporeality in its turn gave out sacred vibrations which established relations with MBA Angela. African tradition, then, conceives of speech as a gift of God. It is at once divine in the downward direction and sacred as it rises upwards. Speech in man as creative power MBA Angela, it is taught, deposited in MBA the three potentialities of ability, willing and knowing contained in the 20 components of which he was composed. But all the forces to which he is allied do be within him. They are static, till speech comes and sets them into motion. Then, vivified by the divine word, they begin to vibrate. At a first stage they become thoughts, at a second sound, and at a third words. Speech, spoken words, is therefore regarded as the materialization or externalization of the vibrations of forces. Let me point out, though, that at this level the terms speaking and listening refer to realities far more vast than those we usually attribute to them. It is said, the speech of MBA Angela is seen, is heard, is smelled, is tasted, is touched. It is a total perception, the knowing in which the entire being is engaged. In the same way, since speech is the externalization of the vibrations of forces, every manifestation of a force in any form whatever is to be regarded as its speech. That is why everything in the universe speaks, everything is speech that has taken on body and shape. In Foto, the word for speech pelo is derived from the verbal root hel, the idea of which is to give strength and by extension to make material. Fulani tradition teaches that Ono, the Supreme Being, conferred strength on Kiikala, the first man, by speaking to him. It was talking with God that made Kiikala strong, say the Silated Kiva Fulani master initiates. If speech is strength, that is because it creates a bond of coming and going part, in Foto which generates movement and rhythm and therefore life and action. This movement to and fro is symbolized by the weaver's feet going up and down, as we shall see later in connection with the 170. The living tradition. Traditional crafts. In fact the symbolism of the loom is entirely based on creative speech in action. In the image of MBA Angela's speech, of which it is an echo, human speech sets latent forces into motion. They are activated and aroused by speech, just as a man gets up, or turns, at the sound of his name. Speech may create peace, as it may destroy it. It is like fire. Ilagvi's word may start a war just as one blazing twig may touch off a great conflagration. In Mali an adage, what puts a thing into condition that is, arranges it, disposes it favorably. Speech. What damages a thing? Speech. What keeps a thing as it is? Speech. Tradition, then, confers on Kuma, the word, not only creative power but a double function of saving and destroying. That is why speech. Speech above all, is the great active agent in African magic. Speech, active agent in magic. It must be borne in mind that in the general way all African traditions postulate the religious vision of the world. The visible universe is thought of and felt as the sign, the concretization or the outer shell of an invisible, living universe, consisting of forces in perpetual motion. Within this vast cosmic unity everything is connected, everything is bound solidly together, and man's behavior both as regards himself and as regards the world around him, the mineral, vegetable, animal world and human society, is subject to a very precise ritual regulation, which may vary in form with the various ethnicities and regions. Violation of sacred laws was supposed to cause an upset in the balance of forces which would take expression in disturbances of different kinds. That is why magic action, that is, the manipulation of forces, generally aimed at restoring the troubled balance, re-establishing the harmony of which, as we have seen, man had been set up as guardian by his creator. The word magic is always taken in a bad sense in Europe, whereas in Africa it simply means management of forces, a thing neutral in itself which may prove helpful or harmful according to the direction it is given. It is said, neither magic nor fortune is bad in itself. It is use of them that makes them good or bad. Good magic, the magic of initiates and masters of knowledge, aims at purifying men, animals and objects so as to put forces back into order. This is where the force of speech is decisive. For just as Angela's divine speech animated the cosmic forces that lay static in so man's speech animates, sets into motion and rouses the forces that are static in things. But for spoken words to produce their full effect they must be chanted rhythmically, because movement needs rhythm, which is itself based on the secret of numbers. Speech must reproduce the to and fro that is the essence of rhythm. In ritual songs and incantatory formulae, therefore, speech is the 171 methodology and African prehistory materialization of cadence. And if it is considered as having the power to act on spirits, that is because its harmony creates movements which generate forces. Those forces are then acting on spirits which themselves are powers for action. In African tradition, speech, deriving its creative and operative power from the sacred, is in direct relation with the maintenance or the rupture of harmony in man and the world about him. That is why most traditional oral societies consider lying as an actual moral leprosy. In traditional Africa the man breaks his word, kills his civil, religious and occult person. He cuts himself off from himself and from society. Better for him to die than to go on living, both for himself and for his family. The singer of the Kombo Divi at Kulakaro, in Mali, in one of his ritual poems, sang, "Speech is divinely accurate, one must be accurate with it. The tongue that falsifies the word taints the blood of him that lies." Here blood symbolizes the inner vital force whose harmony is disturbed by the light. Who spoils his word spoils himself, says the adage. When a man thinks one thing and says another he cuts himself off from himself. He breaks the sacred unity, the reflection of cosmic unity, creating discord in and around him. Then we can better understand the magico-religious and social context of respect for the word in societies with an oral tradition, especially when it comes to transmitting words inherited from ancestors or elders. The thing traditional Africa holds dearest is its ancestral heritage. Its religious attachment to all that has been passed down comes out in phrases like "I have it from my master," "I have it from my father," "I sucked it at my mother's breast." The traditionalists, the great repositories of this oral heritage, are the persons who are called traditionalists. They, the living memory of Africa, are the best witness of it. Who are these masters. In Bambara, they are called Omos or Somos, the knowers, or Donakabas, makers of knowledge. In Foto, they are called, according to region, Silatikis, Gandos or Shiriknis, words which have the same sense of knower. They may be master initiates and masters of initiates in one particular traditional branch, initiations of the smith, the weaver, the hunter, the fisherman, etc., or may possess complete knowledge of the tradition in all its aspects. Thus there are Omos who know the blacksmith's science, the 172. The living tradition shepherds, the weavers, as well as of the great initiation schools of the savannah, in Mali, for instance, the Kombo, the Kor, the Name, the Dio, the Diawara, the Enile, the Niawaro, and so on. But let us make no mistake. African tradition does not cut life into slices, and the knower is rarely a specialist. As a rule he is a generalist. For example, one and the same old man will be learned not only in plant science the good or bad properties of every plant, but in earth sciences the agricultural or medicinal properties of the different kinds of soil, and water sciences, and astronomy, cosmogony, psychology, and so on. What is involved is a science of life in which knowledges can always be turned to practical use. And when we speak of initiatory or occult sciences, terms that may confuse the Western reader. Traditional Africa always understands by this an eminently practical science which consists in knowing how to enter into the appropriate relationship with the forces that underlie the visible world and can be made to serve life. Keeper of the secrets of cosmic genesis and the sciences of life, the traditionalist, usually gifted with a prodigious memory, is often also the archivist of the past events, transmitted by tradition, or of contemporary events. Therefore, a history intended to be essentially African must necessarily depend on the irreplaceable testimony of qualified Africans. You cannot dress a person's hair when he is away, says the adage. The great Omas, those with total knowledge, were known and venerated, and people came from afar to appeal to their knowledge and wisdom. Pardo Dembo, who initiated them into things Fulani, was a Fulani Doma Silatiki. He is dead now. Charlie Essa, another Fulani Silatiki, is still alive. Dan Fulsine, who used to come to my father's house when I was a child, was a well-known universal Doma. Not only was he a Grand Master Initiate of the Kombo, but he possessed all the other knowledges of his time, knowledge pertaining to history, initiation or natural sciences. He was known to everyone in the region between Chikaso and Bamako, that is, the old kingdoms of Kenadougou and Balidougou. His younger brother Latif, who had experienced the same initiations, was also a great Oma. He had the additional advantage of reading and writing Arabic and of having done his military service in the French forces in Chad, so that he was able to pick up a great deal of knowledge in the Chadian savannah which proved to be similar to what was taught in Mali. I was, of the Dili caste, is one of the greatest MNEE traditionalists now alive in Mali, as is Bonzo Mana, the great blind musician. Here I should make it plain that a Dili is not necessarily a traditionalist but may become one if his aptitudes lie that way. But he cannot gain access to the Kombo initiation, from which Dilis are barred. 3. For the Dili, see below, pages 187 to 92. 173. Methodology and African Prehistory. Generally speaking, the traditionalists were brushed aside but not actually proceeded against by the colonial power, which needless to say sought to uproot local traditions in order to implant its own ideas, for, as they say, neither in a planted field nor in a fallowish one south. For that reason initiation usually took refuge in the bush and quit the large towns, which were called Tababudougus or towns of the whites, meaning the colonizers. Yet in the different countries of the African savannah that make up the Old Buffer, and doubtless elsewhere too, there still exist knowers who continue to transmit the sacred heritage to those who consent to learn and listen and show themselves worthy of receiving instruction by their patience and their discretion, basic rules required by the gods. In 10 or 15 years all the last great Omas, all the last old men who have inherited the various branches of the tradition, will probably have vanished. If we do not make haste to gather their evidence and their teaching, the whole cultural and spiritual patrimony of a people will go down into oblivion with them and a rootless younger generation be abandoned to its OW and devices. Authenticity of transmission more than all other MBN the traditionalist I/OMW, great and small, are bound to respect the truth. For them lying is not merely a moral blemish but a ritual interdict, violation of which would make it impossible for them to fulfill their function. The liar could not be an initiator or a master of the knife, still less a Doma. And if the unheard of happened and a traditionalist Hirawat proved to be a liar, no one would ever turn to him again for anything, and his function would vanish on the spot. Generally speaking, African tradition has a horror of the lie. It is said, take care not to cut yourself off from yourself. Better for the world to be cut off from you than for you to be cut off from yourself. But the ritual band-on-lighting affects more particularly all officiants or sacrificers, or masters of the knife, and so on for of all degrees, beginning with the father of a family who is sacrificer or officiant for his household, going on through the smith, the weaver, the traditional craftsman. Practice of one's craft being a sacred activity, as we shall see. The prohibition strikes at all who have to carry out some magico-religious responsibility and perform ritual acts and are thereby in a way intermediaries between Kombo and mortals and the tutelary forces. At the summit are the sacred officiant of the country, for example, the Hogan, among the Dodons and eventually the king. This ritual prohibition exists, to the best of my knowledge, in all the traditions of the African savannah. The reason for the ban on lying is that if an officiant lied he would vitiate for. Not all ritual ceremonies necessarily involved the sacrifice of an animal. The sacrifice may consist of an offering of millet, milk or some other natural product. 174. The living tradition. Ritual acts. He would no longer fulfill all the ritual conditions necessary for performing the sacred act, the chief one being that he himself be in harmony before he manipulates the forces of life. For let us not forget that all African magico-religious systems aim at preserving or re-establishing the balance of forces on which the harmony of the surrounding world, material and spiritual, depends. More than all others, the idiomas are bound by this obligation, for as master initiates they are the great holders of the word, the principal active agency of human life and of spirits. They are the heirs of sacred incantatory words passed on down by the chain of ancestors, words which can be traced back to those sacred first vibrations emitted by Mba, the first man. I shall cite the case of a Dogon master of the knife from the Pinari country Bangdayagar district Whom I knew in my youth and who had once been led to lie in order to save the life of a hunted woman Whom he had hidden in his house. After that incident he voluntarily resigned his office, deeming that he no longer fulfilled the ritual conditions which would make his tenure valid. And religious and sacred things are concerned, the traditional Grand Masters are not afraid of the unfavorable opinion of the masses, and should they happen to make a mistake they acknowledge their error publicly, without calculated or evasive excuses. For them, confessing any faults they may commit is an obligation, for it is a purification from defilement. If the traditionalist or knower is so respected in Africa, it is because, to begin with, he respects himself inwardly in good order, since he must never lie. He is a well-regulated man, master of the forces that inhabit him. Round about him things fall into line and disturbances subside. Even aside from this prohibition against lying, he disciplines his speech and does not utter it recklessly. For if speech, as we have seen, is regarded as an externalization of the vibrations of inner forces, conversely inner force is born of the internalizing of speech. If the traditionalist I/OFL is the holder of speech, other men are the depositories of small talk. Given this way of looking at things, the importance traditional African education attaches to self-control can be better understood. To speak sparingly is the mark of a good education and the sign of nobility. Very early the young boy learns to master the expression of his emotions or his suffering, to contain the forces that are in him, in the image of the primordial Mba who with him, submissive and orderly, contain all the forces of the cosmos. Of the respected knower or a man who is master of himself people will say, he's a mar. Or, in full, a natto, that is, a complete man. We must not confuse the traditionalist I/Oza, who know how to teach by amusing and by putting themselves within their audience's reach, with minstrels, storytellers and public entertainers, who are usually of the daily. J75. Methodology and African Prehistory. And will also house captive 5 castes. For these, the discipline of truth does not exist, and as we shall see later tradition recognizes their right to travesty or embellish the facts, even grossly, so long as they contrive to divert or embarrass their public. The daily, people say, is allowed to have 2 tongues. By contrast, no African from a traditionalist background would dream of questioning the veracity of what a traditionalist I/O/WA says, especially when it is a matter of passing on knowledge inherited from the line of ancestors. Before speaking, the Doma out of deference addresses the souls of former men and asks them to come to his aid and save him from a slip of the tongue or a lapse of memory that would make him leave something out. Danful sign, the great Bombaradomo Whom I knew in my childhood at Buguni and who was the Kompo chanter, used to say before embarking on a story or a lesson, O soul of an Y master timeable Nsame. O souls of old smiths and old weavers, first initiating ancestors come from the east. O Gigi, great man who first blew on the drum of Kompo, when he came on the Chelaba Niger. Combe all of you and hearken to MB. In accordance with your sayings, I am going to tell them why here's how things have happened, from you in the past to us here present, so that what is said may be guarded as something precious and faithfully transmitted to the men of tomorrow who will be our children, and the children of our children. Hold the reins of a white tongue well, so you ancestors. Guide them by words as they come forth that they may follow and respect their natural order. Then he would add, I, Danfo sign, of the clan of Sir Make the male elephant am about to tell you the tale as I learned it, in presence of my two witnesses Makaro and Manafin. 6. 5. The Wolosos literally, ones born in the house or house captives were servants or servant families attached for generations to one household. Tradition allowed them complete freedom of gesture and speech as well as considerable material rights over their master's possessions. 6. Makaro and Manafin were his two co-disciples. 176. The living tradition? They both know the warp as I do. 7. They will serve them both as surveillance and as props. If the storyteller made a mistake or forgot something, his witness would take him up, M.E.N. Mind your manner of opening your mouth. To which he would reply, excuse it, my ardent tongue has played me false. A traditionalist is who is not a smith by birth but no sciences relating to the forge will say before talking of it, I owe that to so and so, who owes it to so and so, etc. He will pay homage to the ancestor of the smiths, crouching in token of allegiance, with the tip of his elbow on the ground and his forearm raised. The Doma also may cite his master and say, I render homage to all the intermediaries back to none they right. 8. Without having to mention all the names. Always there is reference to the chain in which the Doma himself is but one link. In all branches of traditional knowledge the chain of transmission is of supreme importance. If there is no regular transmission there is no magic, only conversation or storytelling. Speech is then the operative. Transmitted through the chain, it is supposed to convey, from the original transmission on, a force that makes it operative and sacramental. This notion of respect for the chain or respect for transmission means that an African who has not been influenced by European culture will generally tend to report a story in the very form in which he heard it, aided by the prodigious memory illiterate persons have. If contradicted, he will merely answer, so and so taught it to be like that, always naming his source. Beyond the traditionalist idiomas' personal integrity and their attachment to a chain of transmission, an additional guarantee of authenticity is provided by permanent control by the peers or elders who surround them, who keep a jealous guard on the authenticity of what they transmit and take them up on the slightest error, as we have seen in the instance of Danfo sign. In the course of his ritual excursions into the bush, the Kombo chanter may add meditations or inspirations of his own to the traditional words he has inherited from the chain and sings for his companions. His words, new links, then serve to enrich the words of his predecessors, but he gives the warning, this is what I am adding, this what I am saying. I am not infallible, I may be wrong. If I am, do not forget that like you I live on a handful of millet, a mouthful of water, and some whiffs of air. MBN is not infallible. The initiates and the neophytes who accompany him learn these new words, so that all the Kombo songs are known and kept in their memories. The degree of a Kombo disciple's evolution is measured not by the 7. A traditional story always has a thread or immovable base which must never be modified but on which one may embroider developments or embellishments as inspiration for the attention of one's auditors suggests. 8. Ancestor of Smiths. 177. Methodology and African prehistory. Quantity of words he has learned but by the conformity of his life to those words. If a man has only 10 or 12 Kombo words and lives them, then he becomes a valuable adherent of the Kombo within his association. To be a Kombo chanter, then a master initiate, one must know the inherited words in their totality, and live them. Traditional education, especially when it concerns knowledge associated with an initiation, is linked with experience and integrated into life. That is why the researcher, European or African, who wants to get close to African religious facts condemns himself to remaining on the outer edge of the subject unless he consents to live the initiation that corresponds to them and accept its rules, which presupposes at the very least a knowledge of the language. For there are things that are not to be explained but are experienced and lived. I remember that in 1928, when I was serving in Tigan, a young anthropologist arrived in the country to make a study of the sacrificial hand at circumcision. The French commandant went to the headman of the indigenous canton and asked that everything be done to satisfy the anthropologist, insisting that he be told everything. In his turn the headman assembled the leading citizens. He laid the facts before them, repeating the common dance words. The leading man of the assembly, who was the master of the knife in that particular place and therefore responsible for circumcision ceremonies and the corresponding initiation, asked him, "He wants us to tell him everything." "Yes," replied the canton headman. "But has he come to be circumcised?" "No, he has come for information." The old man turned his face away from the headman. "Can we tell him everything?" he demanded, "if he does not want to be circumcised?" "You know well, perfectly well, Chief, that's impossible. He will have to live the life of those who are circumcised, for us to teach him all the lessons." "Since we are obliged by force to give satisfaction," the canton headman returned, "it's up to you to find us a way out of the difficulty." "Very well," said the old man. "We shall get rid of him without appearing to, by putting him in the straw." This putting in the straw or hoodwinking, which consists of deceiving the person with some native tale when you don't want to tell him the truth, was invented when the colonial power sent its agents or representatives to do anthropological research without their consenting to live under the requisite conditions. Many anthropologists were unwilling victims of this policy later, and many others, without actually having been led up the garden path, imagined that they understood the thing completely when, not having lived it, they could not truly know it. Beyond the esoteric instruction given in the great initiation schools like the KOM or the others mentioned above, traditional education actually 178. The living tradition begins in each and every family, where the father, the mother or the older persons are at once masters and teachers and constitute the first cell of the traditionalists. They are the ones who give the first lessons in life, not only through experience but through the medium of stories, fables, legends, maxims, adages, and so on. Proverbs are missives bequeathed to posterity by the ancestors. Their number is legion. Certain children's games have been worked out by initiates with an end to conveying certain ciphered esoteric knowledge through the ages. I might mention for example the Bayangolo game, in Mali, which is based on a numeral system related to the 266 Sikaba or signs that correspond to the attributes of God. Moreover, education is not systematic but is tied in with the circumstances of life. This manner of proceeding may seem chaotic, but in fact it is very practical and very live. The lesson given on the occasion of some special event or experience is deeply graven on a child's memory. If an old teacher comes upon an anthill during a walk in the bush, this gives him an opportunity for dispensing various kinds of knowledge according to the kind of listeners he has at hand. Either he will speak of the creature itself, the laws governing its life and the class of being it belongs to, or he will give children a lesson in morality by showing them community life depends on solidarity and forgetfulness of self, or again he may go on to higher things if he feels that his audience can attain to them. Thus any incident in life, any trivial happening, can always be developed in many ways, can lead to telling the myth, the tale, the legend. Every phenomenon one encounters can be traced back to the forces from which it issued and suggest the mysteries of the unity of life, which is entirely animated by Southeast, the primordial sacred force, itself an aspect of God the Creator. In Africa, everything is history. The grand history of life includes the history of lands, lakes and rivers, geography, the history of plants, botany and pharmaceutics, the history of the suns of the WOMB of the earth, mineralogy, metals, the history of the stars, astronomy, astrology, the history of water, and so on. In Savannah tradition, particularly in the Bambara and Fulani traditions, the total of the manifestations of life on earth is divided into three categories or classes of being, each subdivided into three groups, one at the bottom of the scale, inanimate, the so-called mute beings, whose language is considered occult, since it is incomprehensible or inaudible to mortals. This class of beings includes everything that lies on the surface of the earth, sand, water, or resides within it, minerals, metals, etc. The mute inanimates find solid, liquid and gaseous, literally, smoking inanimates. 2. In the middle degree, immobile inanimates, beings that are living but do not move. This is the class of plants, which can stretch. 179. Methodology and African prehistory, or open out in space but cannot move their feet. The mobile animates fine creeping, climbing and upright plants, the last class being the highest. 3. Finally, mobile animates, which include all animals, up to man. The mobile animates include land animals with and without bones, aquatic animals and flying animals. Everything that exists can therefore be placed in one or another of these categories. 9. Though of all the histories, the greatest and most meaningful is that of man itself, the symbiosis of all of them, since according to myth he was made up of a bit of everything that existed before him. All the kingdoms of life, mineral, vegetable and animal, are found in him, conjoined with multiple forces and higher faculties. Teachings about man are based on myths of the cosmogony which determine his place and role in the universe, and they reveal what his relationship with the world of the living and the dead ought to be. They will explain both the symbolism of his body and the complexity of his psyche. The persons of the person are many in the person, say the Bambara and Fulani traditions. Man will be taught how he ought to behave towards nature, how to respect its equilibrium and not disturb the forces that animate it, and of which it is only the outward and visible show. Initiation will show him his relationship with the world of these forces and lead him little by little towards self-mastery, the ultimate goal being to become, like MBA, a complete MBN, interlocutor of Angela and guardian of the living world. The traditional crafts. The traditional artisanal crafts are great vectors of oral tradition. In the traditional African society, often human activities had a sacred or occult character, particularly those activities that consist in acting on matter and transforming it, since everything is regarded as alive. Every artisanal function was linked with an esoteric knowledge transmitted from generation to generation and taking its origin in an initial revelation. The craftsman's work was sacred because it imitated the work of Angela and supplemented his creation. Bambara tradition, in fact, teaches that creation is not yet finished and that Angela, in creating our earth, left things there unfinished so that his interlocutor, might supplement or modify them with a view to leading nature towards its perfection. The craftsman's activity in operation was supposed to repeat the mystery of creation. It therefore focused an occult force which one could not approach without respecting certain ritual conditions. Traditional craftsmen accompany their work with ritual chants or sacramental rhythmic words, and their very gestures are considered a 9. Cf. They have 8 Bach, 1972, pages 23 il. 180. The living tradition. Language. In fact, the gestures of each craft reproduce in a symbolism proper to each one the mystery of the primal creation, which, as I indicated earlier, was bound up with the power of the word. It is said, the smith forges the word, the weaver weaves it, the leather worker curries it smooth. Let us take the example of the weaver, whose craft is linked with the symbolism of the creative word deploying itself in time and space. A man who is a weaver by caste imago. Among the Fulani is the repository of the secrets of the 33 pieces that are basic to the loom, each of which has a meaning. The frame, for example, is made up of 8 main pieces of wood, 4 vertical ones that symbolize not only the 4 mother elements earth, water, air, fire but the 4 main points of the compass, and 4 transverse ones that symbolize the 4 collateral points. The weaver, placed in the middle, represents primordial MBA, at the heart of the 8 directions of space. With his presence, we obtain 9 elements which recall the 9 fundamental states of existence, the 9 classes of being, the 9 openings of the body gates of the forces of life, the 9 categories of men among the Fulani, etc., etc. Before beginning work the weaver must touch each piece of the loom, pronouncing words or litanies that correspond to the forces of life embodied in them. The movement of his feet to and fro as they go up and down to work the pedals recalls the original rhythm of the creative word, linked with the dualism of all things and the law of cycles. His feet are supposed to speak as follows: Fonte, Fortiaco, dualism, dualism. When one goes up the other goes down. There is the death of the king and the coronation of the prince, the death of the grandfather and the birth of the grandson. Quarrels over divorce commingled with the sound of a marriage feast. For its part, the shuttle says, I am the bark of fate. I pass between the reefs of the threads of the warp that stand for life. From the right bank I pass to the left, unreeling them intestine the thread to contribute to the fabric. And then again from the left bank I pass to the right, unreeling them intestine. Life is a perpetual to and fro, a permanent giving of the self. 181. Methodology and African prehistory. The strip of cloth accumulating and winding around a stick resting on the weaver's belly represents the past, while the reel of thread still to be woven, unwound, symbolizes the mystery of tomorrow, the unknown what is to be. The weaver always says, "Oh, tomorrow. Hold no unpleasant surprise in store for me." In all, the weaver's work represents 8 movements to and fro movements of his feet, his arms, the shuttle and the rhythmic crossing of the thread of the fabric that correspond to the 8 pieces of wood in the loom frame and the 8 legs of the mythical spider which taught its science to the weaver's ancestor. As for the smith, he is the depository of the secret of transmutations. He is preeminently the master of fire. His origin is mythical, and in Bambara tradition he is called the first son of the earth. His skills go back to Mba, the first man, Whom his creator Mba Angela taught amongst other things the secrets of metalworking. That is why the forge is called Fan, by the same name as Fan, the primordial egg from which the whole universe issued forth and which was the first sacred forge. The elements of the smithy are linked to a sexual symbolism, itself the expression or reflection of a cosmic process of creation. Thus the 2 round bellows worked by the smith's assistant are likened to the male's 2 testicles. The air they are filled with is the substance of life, sent through a kind of tube that represents the phallus into the furnace of the forge, this representing the womb where the transforming fire works. The traditional smith may enter the smithy only after a ritual purifying bath prepared with a decoction of certain leaves or barks or roots of trees chosen according to the day. For plants like minerals and animals are divided into 7 classes corresponding to the days of the week handling by the law of analogic correspondence. 10 Then the smith guards himself in a special way, since he may not penetrate the forge dressed in just any sort of clothes. Every morning he purifies the smithy by means of special fumigations based on plants he knows of. These operations over, cleansed of all outside contacts he has had, the smith is in the sacramental state. He has become pure once again and is equivalent to the primordial smith. Only now can he create in imitation of an Angela, by modifying and fashioning matter. In Foto, the name of the smith is Pelo, the word which literally means transformer. Before beginning work he invokes the 4 mother elements of creation: earth, water, air, fire, which aren't necessarily represented in the forge. There is always a receptacle filled with water, fire in the furnace, air sent by the bellows, and a little pile of earth beside the forge. During his work, he pronounces special words as he touches each tool. Taking his anvil, which symbolizes feminine receptivity, he says, "I am not the Angela, I am the representative of the Angela." It is he who creates and I'll. The law of analogic correspondence ca. Hamp 8 Bach, 1972, pages I2 off. 182. The living tradition. Not I. Then he takes some water and egg and presents it to the anvil, saying, "Here is your bride price." He takes his hammer, which symbolizes the phallus, and strikes the anvil a few times to sensitize it. Communication established, he can begin to work. The apprentice must not ask questions. He must only look and blow. This is the mute phase of apprenticeship. As he advances in knowledge, he blows in rhythms that are more and more complex, each one having a meaning. During the oral stage of apprenticeship, the master will gradually transmit all his skills to the pupil, training him and correcting him until he acquires mastery. Then, after a liberation ceremony, the new smith may leave his master and set up his own forge. The smith usually sends his own children to another smith to serve their apprenticeship. The adage goes, "The master's wives and children are not his best pupils." Thus the traditional artisan, imitating the Angela, repeating the primal creation by his gestures, used to perform, not work, in the purely economic sense of the word, but a sacred function that brought the fundamental forces of life into play and engaged him in his entire being. In the secrecy of his workshop or his smithy he partook of the renewed mystery of eternal creation. The smith must have knowledge covering the vast sector of life. With his repute as an occultist, his mastery of the secrets of fire and iron make him the only person entitled to perform circumcision, and, as we have seen, the Grand Master of the knife in the KOMO initiation is always the smith. Not only is he learned in all that pertains to metals, He is expert also in the classification of plants and their properties. The operator of a high furnace, who both smelts and casts the metal, is the man who is furthest advanced in knowledge. In addition to all his knowledge of metallurgy, he has a perfect knowledge of the sons of the womb of the earth, mineralogy and the secrets of plants and the bush. Indeed, he knows what kind of vegetation covers the earth, where it contains the particular metal, and he can detect the lode of gold merely by examining plants and pebbles. He knows the incantations to the earth and the incantations to plants. Nature being regarded as living and as animated by forces, any act that disturbs it must be accompanied by a ritual behavior designed to save and safeguard its sacred equilibrium, for everything is connected, everything echoes everything else, every action agitates the life forces and sets up a chain of consequences, the repercussions of which are felt by man. The relationship of traditional MBN with the world was therefore a living relationship of participation, not of pure utilization. It is understandable that in this all-inclusive vision of the universe, a role of the profane is negligible. For example, in the old Ball country, gold, in which the earth was rich, was viewed as a divine metal and was not exploited to excess. It was used above all for the making of royal or religious objects, and also served as a